Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn more at uber.com/flexibilityworks.
CHEK Podcasts.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the latest in BC politics. I'm your host, Rob Shaw, coming to you as always from the CHEK News World Headquarters here in Victoria. Lots to get into on today's show, from new anti-racism funding to controversial changes to the status of Uber drivers and gig workers in British Columbia, and even a look at the NDP convention happening this weekend. To break it all down, let's bring in the pod squad: Jeff Ferrier from Framepoint Strategies, Allie from MASH Strategies. Jillian's off this week, but joining us is Carlie Pochynok, a senior director with Hill and Knowlton, and also former communications director for the opposition BC Liberal Caucus and in the 2017 and 2020 election campaigns. Welcome, Carlie. Thanks for coming here.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, we're going to throw you into the deep end here as we start with our first topic, the long-awaited decision by the NDP government on the job rights of people who work in the gig economy, driving for Skip the Dishes or Uber or Lyft or one of those platforms. The NDP have been a lot of pressure facing them from the organized labor front to define these folks as employees and give them minimum standards on sick days and vacation and things like that. The tech companies say that's impossible when people are jumping on and off platforms for multiple companies at random times, and they want flexibility. So the NDP kind of lands in the middle of both of that, which we'll get into, and try to analyze, I guess, what to make of this decision that's going to affect a lot of people as we go forward in the future economy. Carlie, what did you think of how the NDP handled this, and B, what do you think the implications might be?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. So I'll start by saying, I'm a little ashamed. I actually didn't realize how difficult it was for gig workers in BC and across Canada. So I think shedding a little bit of light on the realities of a lot of people here in the Lower Mainland and across the province and across the country, I think is really helpful. And, in terms of the rollout, to me, it read like a typical we've got some good things in the wings coming. Wait and see how the regulations and legislation plays out. I think we see that quite often with bigger government announcements that involve a lot of players and a lot of people's willingness to participate in these things and kind of go willingly, if you will say. Good news, I think, but also, I think it also speaks to the reality of our economy and how many people are participating in gig work. I think you'll see a lot of people who have regular 9-to-5 jobs participating in these kind of jobs on the side because, everything's so expensive now. So I think shining a light on the reality of how hard people are working and ensuring that those people, and, I think, in the government news release, it did indicate, and I think truthfully, that it's a lot of new Canadians. And so making sure that people who come here to build a life are being treated fairly as well. So,
yeah. Are you telling me, Carlie, that when you get sushi delivered on Skip the Dishes at 9 p.m., you've never quizzed your driver on the details of his employment status?
I'm the person who says, please leave it outside. And then I kind of peer around the door like a little witch in the hut. So no, I haven't, but now I don't have to. So
yeah, fair enough. Allie, the way the government landed here is it did designate folks as employees under the law, but then it also exempted them from a lot of the employee kind of legalities of sick days and vacation, stat holidays, that type of thing. The companies have to pay into WorkSafe BC in case someone gets injured. So kind of, I guess, again, that middle ground. Allie, what did you make of it?
Well, you mentioned something, the long-awaited, and it was long-awaited indeed. So I did a little bit of research on the interwebs, and the first time that this actually came up was in the 2020 election by the leader then, John Horgan. And so I think a lot of the things that I have observation on this week, it's long-awaited, it's been a delay, it took way too long. That'll come up with the hotline later on the show. But if this was announced in 2020, like, why did it take so long to get to this point? And that's just like the NDP specialty is. We've identified an issue. We know that we need to fix it, but it's going to take us between 5 to 10 years to sort out all of the logistics. And I understand this is a very complicated issue. One of the other things that I think might be one of the unintended consequences is very much like when we raised the minimum wage, the cost was passed on to the consumer. Here's what I'll say about that. If it is, then fine. Like, I reserve the luxury of never leaving my home for my Uber Eats, and therefore I will buy into it. But I don't think that that is a complaint that we as British Columbians should be going off about when that eventually comes. Because in order for someone to pay for this, hopefully isn't the government that ends up paying for it, but rather the company. And so that's to come. But I don't think it's actually that big of an issue. But one of the things that I thought was very, very interesting is how actually the federal NDP label this whole gig economy industry. So in BC, the last time they did any sort of like survey, there was about 265,000 people that participate in the gig economy. And on the federal NDP website, they kind of label it as the last resort, that this isn't a glorious position and that people are resorting to the gig economy to boost their income. I actually think it's the opposite. I think this is a really great way to supplement your income, especially in this economy. An extra few $1,000s every year isn't a bad thing. And then the federal NDP call it like this wealthy corporation, and that is kind of like the big and bad, but it's that wealthy corporation that's giving out these jobs. So I thought that was very interesting to villainize these companies.
Mm-hmm. Well, the gulf between the federal NDP and reality is sometimes a lot larger than the one with the provincial NDP that actually have to govern, and the reality, Jeff. And maybe that's why this took so long. And I know there was a what did government hear kind of survey done in the middle of this, where a lot of drivers said, look, we want that flexibility that Allie just talked about. We're not interested. We may already have jobs. We don't need to be defined in a set 9-hour shift for Uber, with a minimum wage, when we're kind of trying to do something different there. And maybe that's why this took so long.
Yeah, I think it took so long because it's not just a big complicated issue. It's that there's a lot of voices with a lot of vested interests speaking out and trying to assert their points of view. And you saw that on the business side. You saw that on the labor side. Allie's talked about, the federal political side. I think what the provincial NDP did here, and it took a long time to separate out that noise and to really hone in on the workers who are working in this industry and figure out what the heck it is that they want, because this is fundamentally about them. And I think when you look at what the government's brought forward here, that they've done a pretty good job of listening to those workers and getting them what they wanted. They wanted fair pay, they wanted protections if they get hurt on the job, but they also wanted flexibility to choose when they do their own work, right? So businesses aren't necessarily happy, labor isn't happy, but workers are happy that there's these strong new rules for fair pay. So there's a guaranteed wage and a ban on tip theft, which anyone who does tip theft, there's a special place in hell for you. Don't do that. And now you can't.
It's just, and Jeff, that No Context BC is just going to take out the little part that says there's a special place in hell for you and just air that again and again and again, right?
Well, we've got to get a clip from the show in every week. So if that's the one for this week, huzzah for that. And the work-safe protection. So if you're hurt on the job, now you're covered. But Carlie and Allie talked about this. This is not a workforce that fits neatly into stereotypes. So you've got people juggling families, they're juggling other jobs, their studies. They want to keep control over how they work and when they work, and they value flexibility above all else, and they're going to get to keep that with this. So the real politics here, what do the workers think? I think the workers will be happy, and so the government landed something good and smart on this file, I think.
Always that kind of comment that when no one's really happy with the government policy, maybe the government's actually struck a balance. So that appears to be the case in this one. Let's move on to another long-awaited government announcement. This time, the Premier unveiling an anti-racism hotline this week, which by the time it opens in the spring, will have been 3 full years since it was first promised. Way back in the pandemic era, when hate crimes against people of Asian descent were on the rise, and now we have anti-Semitism from the Israeli-Hamas war and all sorts of acts of vandalism and violence across the province. So there's community grants, and then this hotline. Carlie, we're going to go back to you on this. Took a while again, but has what the government done here and the way they've done it made sense to you?
Yeah. So, again, as a person who hasn't had to access these services before, I'm speaking, from that really high level of overall good. Like, this is a great thing that people need. And I think, especially as we see more and more of these instances and they're more and more widespread, social media is out of control in terms of taking a single message and spreading it far and wide, a hateful message. And so, ensuring that people are heard and that they know that people are listening to them is really important. I understand that it took a long time, and to be frank, that doesn't surprise me with this government. I think they do like to say a lot of things that sound good in a comms plan and look great in a news release, and then we'll get to it when we get to it. And so the timing to me isn't super shocking. I think we saw a lot of that in the 2017 to 2020 era as well. What's interesting to me is what's the plan? What are you going to do with what's the plan with the data? What's the plan? So somebody calls this line and reports something or shares this information, where does it go? That wasn't really clear to me. And if you're encouraging people to come forward and, if they don't want to report directly to the police and you're giving them another opportunity to share this information, great. Where does the information go? And I think that's really important, especially as things get worse, as people get more and more stressed out, as we see more and more of these instances. What is happening to the people who are doing them? Does the data go back to, finding the perpetrators? And so I think, if we're going to keep using the man of action moniker, I think including the action piece in it as well is going to be more helpful, especially for things going forward like this, because I think the buck can't just stop when you hang up the phone. We need to know what you're going to do with this. So
yeah, Jeff, it was a question that the Premier faced that Carlie just raised. This balance between entire communities who maybe have a different relationship with the police than those of us who were born here in British Columbia did, and they don't trust them perhaps as much, and they fear retribution, and so they want this hotline as a way to sort of say something that they might not be able to say to the police. But then it does raise that question about how you catch the perpetrators and prosecute them and prevent them from spreading their hate elsewhere. That balance is one that I think the government's had to wrestle with here and try to figure out as it launches this thing.
Yeah, I don't pretend to be an expert on those things, but I think that at a time like this, when hate incidents are on the rise and people are being targeted because they're Jewish or they're Muslim or they're Asian or they're LGBTQ, and they're saying we would like another tool, it'll make us feel safer, it'll give us another avenue to report these things that are happening so that they can, someone will help us and they'll stop. That's a good thing. I want to contrast what the Premier is doing here with some other folks are doing. There's some folks who are doing some interesting things, open letters, really divisive stuff. So you've seen local government officials, for example, doing open letters on foreign policy. And that's an easy rabbit hole to go down. There's a lot of emotion and a lot of hurt on all this. I think the Premier is really smart because he doesn't do foreign policy. That's the federal government. That's the government of Canada. So where he's focused is on practical steps that the BC government can do now in our communities in this province to call out hate and divisiveness, to keep people safe and bring communities together. And so I really like for the fund. The fund, I think, is really important. So there's a fund now that if you're the target of hate incidences, there's vandalism. If you're a synagogue and there's swastikas painted on it, or you're a mosque and there's windows broken, we're going to pay for that collectively as a society. And that's a really powerful way, I think, of bringing people together by saying an attack on one is attack on us all. And we all pay to fix that together. And so, I think there's something really simple and powerful and good in that, in a way that some of the more performative responses to what we're seeing, miss the mark and drive people apart at a time when we really need to be bringing people together.
Yep, that's fair. Allie, what do you think?
So every time a politician responds to a horrific racist event with my thoughts and prayers or with this community, I've never, and I've said this before, like, I absolutely hate that line because it doesn't actually do anything. And so this is what could have done something. This is the practical approach that elected representatives could have responded with in a more timely manner. I don't want the NDP to get away with this, because we're all in agreement that this is good. And shout out to MLA Teresa Watt for really driving this for years and ensuring that the NDP government doesn't forget about this and that it's delivered in a timely manner, because it's absolutely needed. But no more thoughts and prayers and more action. This could have been it. And so I don't want Minister Nikki Sharma to get away with this either. And then to add insult to injury, it wasn't just one ministry office that was responsible for this, the Attorney General's office, but it was also Mabel Elmore, who is a parliamentary secretary for anti-racism initiatives. So there's a whole other office that could have helped with this. But meanwhile, 2 ministry offices couldn't figure this out sooner than 3 years. It's absolutely ridiculous. So on my continued rant of things that Nikki Sharma cannot get away with, because that just seems to be the NDP, which now I have a fun name for them, the Never Done Promptly political party. So
you need a sash or a banner or something, I think. Jeff will help you with that.
Perfect. There are a couple of things I don't want her to get away with either. Let's talk about the investigation of $1.2 million in public funds that were used by 2 organizations to buy illicit drugs. Let's also talk about her mandate that says that she also has a mandate to ensure that we live in safer communities. Does anyone feel safer in their community? And then on top of that, Minister Nikki Sharma is the MLA for Vancouver Hastings, where that covers part of downtown core, where a lot of these issues are happening on crime and safety. And so I think we're really, really failing here as a government to provide safer communities, to ensure that our taxpayer dollars are going to things that are actually going to matter, and that ministry offices are just taking way too long to take action.
You got a running list there. Okay. You refer back to that in future shows, your Sharma list. We could keep track of that. I want to get in, before we run out of time on the TV portion of the show here, the NDP convention starting Friday in Victoria. Everyone's gathering here. I think it will be a very celebratory atmosphere for a party riding high in the polls, out fundraising its opponents 2-1 a year before the election, a very popular premier. But what, if anything, are we expecting from the convention? And are there any sort of pitfalls that the party needs to be aware of as it goes into this celebratory weekend? Carlie.
Conventions are always so interesting because aside from horrible hangovers that come from them, the only other thing that I've ever seen really come out of them for parties that aren't super disciplined is really bad sound bites from the debates, from the floor. Given the current state of the world and the propensity, I think, that we've seen, especially, and I've never been to an NDP convention, surprisingly. So I can't speak to what actually goes on inside those rooms, but I do know that they're well known for spirited debates. We see a lot of opinions on the floor. So I'll be curious to see if there's going to be any of those debates and commentary on the current global situation in the Middle East, Are people going to have anything to say about that? And if so, are we going to hear about that as a soundbite that's going to come back and David Eby's going to have to answer for that? And not just that, probably a few other things. But I think, this is where those campaign social media clips are forged in the fire of a convention floor. So I think, I do think the NDP are reasonably disciplined in their message. But can you control 450 people with a beer in their hand? I don't know. So
probably
I feel
not.
like Jeff will probably Jeff's seen more than me, but
Jeff, what's it like to attend an NDP convention? Is it as glamorous and as wonderful as I can imagine?
Instead of talking about the convention, can we talk about how Brian Reynolds was given the Order of BC this week?
I see.
That's a great pivot.
Can we pivot off of that? If you think conventions are celebratory, you've clearly never been to an NDP convention, Rob. And Rob will be at the convention this weekend selling
BC my CAT calendar. Hey, everybody, make sure you buy a CAT calendar for cancer research. Go ahead. I'm just going to put that back down here. But the NDP convention is known for its policy debates, basically.
Yeah, it's big risks, fleeting rewards is what I think of conventions. It's an opportunity to showcase the premier, the good work that the government is doing from the government's perspective. I think there's some really compelling stuff they've done on housing of late. That's the number one issue in British Columbia right now that could be showcased. But it's, conventions are a feedback session. And in big convention halls, it's not really nuanced, incisive critiques that get noticed. It's big emotions. So, fear, anger, indignance. And these play out everywhere at NDP conventions and policy resolution debates, in party officer elections, in challenges to the chair, even on the motion to accept the agenda. You would not believe the drama and the motion to accept the agenda. It is always, and the challenging of the chair, and it's something to behold. My view on the convention is simply this: the danger in that room is always getting too focused on the people in the hall and what they think is right and what they think the way things ought to be according to them, instead of focused on the folks at home. On British Columbians, on understanding where they're at, on meeting them where they're at, and staying focused on actions that will help them on housing and all sorts of other things. And the more that the NDP looks at itself and tries to be the perfect version of itself, the more trouble it's going to get itself into. The more it's focused on British Columbians, the better off it'll be leaving this convention.
Okay, we are out of time there, but we want to encourage you to subscribe to the podcast. We're going to bring Allie in on the podcast extras to talk more about this. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. And thank you to the panel for being here. We'll be back next week with all the latest here on Political Capital. Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn more at uber.com/flexibilityworks.